Arguments are ammunition.
What did he expect in return? Should he not have given you money? Was the money not speech? It was just money after all. It's just like a hooker, I assume. So are you the prostitute? How did this work?
So before you take them into battle...
It's a factor.
It's a factor. I'll give you the factor business.
You did! You're giving me the factor! Common cause!
Let's be sure that they work.
Killing in the name of...
All right, welcome to The Proving Ground, where weak arguments come to die. This is a production of The New Guards. You can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, where we get our posts suspended for saying things like, Leon Trotsky thinks you're Hotsky. My name is Richie Angel. I'm one of your hosts. I'm here with Jacob Hibbert, and we are going to be discussing arguments. There's a lot of arguing going on right now in America and in the world, a lot of hot political topics, and people seem to be kind of speaking past each other, and they don't really know how to have these conversations. So as objectively as possible, we just want to go through what are the best and worst arguments on each side, and more importantly than that even, how to recognize what makes an argument good or what makes an argument bad, different logical fallacies and things of that nature. So we're going to be going through those generally through this series, and we welcome you to come along.
Yeah, we're not going to tell you what to think or what side of an issue to take. We're just going to try to help you better think out through your position, regardless of whatever the issue of today that we cover is. And, for our first episode, what we're going to be covering is a topic that is incredibly hot right now in American politics, and that's the topic or the issue of abortion. A couple of states in the union have recently passed more restrictive laws on abortion. The state of Alabama has effectively banned abortion in all cases. And we are going to go through the best and worst arguments on each side of the abortion issue. Now, currently in the United States, federal law under the Roe v. Wade standard is that abortion is legal across the union up until the second trimester. So that's around 24 weeks. Before Roe v. Wade, this was a states' rights issue. The individual states had individual abortion laws. But under Roe v. Wade, that's the new federal law. And now these states are passing these laws. Like I said, Alabama's banning it in all circumstances. Some states are passing heartbeat bills where you can't have an abortion after a heartbeat is detected. And I'm sure many of you have seen on social media a lot of hot takes, a lot of arguments being thrown out there. And so we're going to kind of go through some of the weaker arguments that often get thrown out there. You'll probably hear some of arguments that you yourself might have used or you've heard other people use as we go through it. And we're going to try to explain, like Richie said, why some of these arguments that we're going to share with you right now are not very good, why they're weak. Mm-hmm. And so the first one that comes to my mind from a pro-life standpoint, seeing pro-lifers do this, is you'll appeal to biblical authority or say, well, the Bible, it says in Jeremiah, before I formed you in the belly, I knew you. Or other verses of that nature that establish some sort of life within the womb or life before birth, and then use that as a justification that God condemns murder. God recognizes that there's life before someone's born. Thus, killing something in the womb is murder according to the Bible. And since we are a biblical nation, we should ban abortion. Now, the problem with that argument is that it's what you would call an appeal to authority. Richie, when people say an appeal to authority, can you explain why an appeal to authority, what it is and why it's not a good argument?
So an appeal to authority almost never, it very rarely works on the offensive, first of all, and it never works if the person that you're talking with does not subscribe to the same authority. So if a Christian pro-life person is speaking with a pro-choice person who is an atheist, then subscribing or appealing to the Bible has absolutely no weight in that conversation. If you bring up the Bible, they're just going to say, well, I don't believe in the Bible, and kaput, and it doesn't work. If you bring up a natural rights argument and the other person doesn't believe in natural rights, then it's hard to make that argument. You have to appeal to the same kind of authority so that you're making sure you're on the same page as other people. Other types of things that make an argument bad are relying on a flawed premise, the premise being something that you have to assume is true in order to then build your argument on top of it. So for instance, another pro-life argument that's rather weak and relies on a flawed, factually incorrect premise is that the law isn't there to protect you from the consequences of your choices. So if you chose to have sex with someone and now you ended up pregnant, deal with it. You just have to deal with the consequences of your actions. That's not technically true. If you go around a bad neighborhood waving around your Rolex and someone mugs you, that's still a crime, and there are still recourses for you to take. Now, your poor choices may have led to that, but there's still recourses and remedies for you to pursue. A woman might make some bad decisions that make it more likely that she will be raped, but rape is still rape, and she can still pursue remedies and recourses for that. So the law is there to protect you. Fraud is another great example of this. You made a bad choice to trust someone who you shouldn't have trusted. You gave them your money. You can still get that money back if it was fraudulent or misrepresentation. Another thing that makes an argument bad is when the other side has a direct counter to it that is far stronger. And I don't just mean debatably stronger, but almost everyone could objectively see that that there's not really a response to that counter, that you can't overcome that. So for instance, on the pro-choice side, a very, very frequent talking point that you'll hear that is not strong is my body, my choice. To which the pro-life response is, how many brains does a pregnant woman have? If the answer is if the answer is one, then clearly that fetus is not her body, because that fetus has a brain. How many hearts does a pregnant woman have? How many fingers and toes does a pregnant woman have? If a pregnant woman is carrying a male fetus, is she now intersex? Does she have a penis and a vagina? Obviously, that fetus is not her body. It is in her body. It is not her body. Whether it's a person, whether it's a fully fledged human being, that's a separate issue. But it is not, strictly speaking, her body. And so my body, my choice doesn't hold up.
Another weak argument that you can see from the pro-choice side is, and I'm sure you've heard this before, Richie, well, if you're only pro-birth, you're not actually pro-life. Because if you were actually pro-life, you would want to give that child health care. You don't care what happens to it after it's born. You don't care about its education, its health care, its mental health, any of those things. You only just want it to be born. So it's like you're pro-birth, not pro-life. And this is an example of a false choice, where you basically present whoever you're arguing with two choices, and as if those are the only two choices available, and make them choose. And that's a logical fallacy. And in this case, for this specific logical fallacy, there's a lot of different things, different choices you can have as a response to this. So, because I don't want a child to be aborted, and I don't think the government should take care of poor people, or should to a very limited extent, doesn't mean I think that they should be killed as an alternative. Private charity, there are other ways and means to take care of those needs that you are rightfully addressing. You do need to have, we do want children to have access to education. We do want them to have access to health care. We do want them to have access to food. But saying that, you either have to let the government do that or kill the baby, that is an unrealistic choice, and really sets up kind of what you could say the Thanos approach to quality of life and to abortion, in the sense that, well, if someone doesn't have quality of life, they don't have food, they don't have health care, they don't have the education that we would hope they have, does that mean then that we should be killing these people? And it's actually funny, there was a congressman, I believe it was in Alabama, it was either Alabama or Mississippi, who actually said this. He's like, we either kill them now, or we have to deal with them on the streets, and they'll die later. And I think, like I said, this is the kind of the Thanos approach, in that if they're going to have all this suffering, then we just need to get rid of all human suffering. All poor people then should die if we present this same false binary choice and take it to its logical conclusion.
All right, so now let's move on to to some of the stronger arguments. We have one each that we've prepared, and sometimes there might be some overlap, but let's talk about the strongest pro-choice argument first. And Jacob, can you walk us through what is the best argument on the pro-choice side of this discussion?
So, in my opinion, the strongest argument on the side of the pro-choice is a kind of a bodily autonomy, life of the mother sort of situation, where where individuals are, kind of reason. You don't even have to appeal to God. You don't have to appeal to anything. You just say, reasonably, people accept that you are justified to use violence or force, to protect yourself. So if someone breaks into your house and is threatening you with a knife or trying to kill you, you're justified in using force to stop that threat. And so if a baby who's in the womb is causing medical problems for the mother that could result in the death of the mother, so say there's some sort of complication, say you get cancer and you need to do chemotherapy, or endoscopic pregnancy is occurring, where the baby being in the body of the mother longer is going to kill the mother, that could be the abortion in that circumstance could be construed or could be seen as force being used to protect the life of the mother. The mother is having this abortion essentially in self-defense to preserve her life. And so on the basis of whether or not this is violence, because abortion is a violent act, it is destroying or killing something that's alive, then that force can be then considered morally justified self-defense.
Okay, now there are two responses that I have to that. So we're going to try to push back on each other, rationalize the positions that we put forward. So the first, and I do have to kind of correct something you said earlier, the current status of law is not the trimester framework under Roe v. Wade. That was changed under Planned Parenthood v. Casey almost 20 years later, where now it's the undue burden standard. However, the trimester framework is still relevant because that's by and large where people's support or opposition to abortion lines up. According to a Gallup poll from just about a year ago, 60% of Americans are pro-choice in the first trimester, and that falls to only 28% are pro-choice in the second trimester and 13% in the third trimester. So it's really that trimester framework, at least in the public view, that makes that distinction. So then I'll enter into this critique of the life of the mother argument. Say I'm a pro-life person, and I'm going to, and you present me with that argument. We need to keep abortions legal because of the life of the mother. First of all, that would not apply at all in the third trimester. And in most, if not all, of the second trimester, it would not apply. Because rather than terminating the pregnancy and then removing the baby or the fetus, you could just induce labor, deliver the baby, and hope or provide the best care possible so that it survives. And if it doesn't, that's tragic, but you didn't actively terminate it. So that wouldn't apply in the second or third trimester. It would only apply in the first. But then let's say that I agreed with you. First trimester, we've got to protect the life of the mother, not saying that the life of the fetus, that it's not 100% a fully living human person, just that, in the scheme of things between life of mother, life of child, they're allowed to make that choice one way or the other, whichever one they think is most appropriate with the doctor or whatever else. So let's say I agree with that. Now, that's 1% of pregnancies, or sorry, not 1% of pregnancies, 1% of abortions that are terminated because of life of the mother concerns. How do you go from there to rationalizing the other 99% of abortions, or at least the other percentage that is conducted in the first trimester?
Usually the response to that is by expanding what health of the mother means, expanding it to be mental health, or some sort of financial situation, an undue stress, undue burden that results in a degradation of mental health that then is used to justify the abortion. I think that that's a little bit of I think that's much more of a stretch, because that opens a whole can of worms of any sort of mental health or some sort of stress that someone inflicts on you. Does that then open the door for you using violence against that person? I have this coworker who has this really irritating itch or cough that causes me really intense stress and depression. I get depressed at work because I know I'm going to hear this colleague clear his throat at least 30 times in the next 3 hours. That mental health stress, am I now justified to use violence against my coworker? No. And so I think that that's one of the shortcomings of this kind of the life of the mother argument that I think you've identified, Richie, is that even if you grant that premise, like you said, 1% to 2% of abortions are the only thing that's covered really in this argument. And it's a difficult jump. I think that you have to start to make a slightly different argument. You have to start to alter your argument a little bit to start to cover the vast majority of other abortions that, like you said, 60% of Americans think would be justified in at least the first trimester.
And I think that you can make the argument even stronger than that, to support this pro-choice argument. And that's that, say we ban all abortions except for ones under this exception of life of the mother concerns, right? And assuming the best intentions of everyone, good faith, don't get into an argument with someone if they're acting in good faith. And if you are arguing with someone, assume that it's in good faith until they give you a reason otherwise. Just because someone disagrees with you does not mean they're evil. Jacob, are 60% of Americans evil for being pro-choice?
No.
Are 72% of Americans evil for being pro-life, or at least not pro-choice in the second trimester?
No, not at all.
No. So you can assume good faith on the part of the other person, at least until they give you some evidence to believe otherwise. But just because they disagree with you doesn't mean they're not acting in good faith. So
And that
assuming the
critical
best,
benefit of doubt is going to go a long way to restoring our ability as a country really to have dialogues and differences of opinion. And we talk a lot about this polarity. You mentioned at the beginning of the show that we have this polarity that's such a problem. It's because we've really stopped giving each other the benefit of the doubt when we have disagreements.
exactly. So assuming the best of these pro-lifers who ban all of these abortions and only allow a life of the mother exception, they are going to be very thorough in doing so, because they don't want to leave loopholes open for people to just claim life of the mother when it's not really a threat, and improperly terminate pregnancies when they don't need to, unnecessarily terminate pregnancies. So there's probably going to be, some paperwork, some very thorough testing, maybe a second opinion from a doctor. But here's the problem. In all that thoroughness, which is understandable because of what they're trying to conserve and protect, on the other side, what if that woman is now in the emergency room? She's bleeding out. She's going to die unless we act quickly. We don't have time for this bureaucracy. And so we need to allow for more flexibility to the doctor, to the woman, to make these kinds of judgment calls. Now, a lot of pro-life people, in accepting the life of the mother exception as well, will cite to suicidal tendencies on the part of the mother, that to prevent her, if she is going to commit suicide, then it's acceptable potentially to terminate her pregnancy. Now, if a woman is feeling suicidal, just because she's feeling suicidal doesn't mean she's going to disclose that to her doctor, especially if she's afraid that that's going to put her in some sort of psychiatric ward or put her on a special watch list or something like that. She might just keep that to herself, but it still might be the reason. And now we would have to disclose that. To prevent her from having to disclose that, to disclose threats from a domestic partner that she needs to terminate the pregnancy or else, or any of these other things, we need to allow that flexibility and just not ask the question. In the first trimester, at least, when a majority of Americans already agree that abortion should be on the table, just kind of allow it, to make sure that we're not unnecessarily terminating the life of the mother. Whereas the other side is focused on terminating the life of the fetus improperly, the other side focuses it on improperly ending the life of the mother. And that makes that argument much, much stronger.
Yeah, I definitely agree. So Richie, what do you believe, or what's your strongest argument that you feel for the pro-choice side?
For the pro-choice side, I think for me, the far and away best argument is that the fetus is not 100% a human person, and you don't believe it is either, saying that to a pro-life person. Even you don't think that it's 100% a person. The argument, or the classic example that will come up is, there's a fire and there's this dish of 20,000 embryos and a 5-year-old child, and who do you save? Or maybe it's an old person, or maybe there's a criminal here and all these embryos, or whatever else, right? But it's even more than that. If a woman has a miscarriage, we don't typically have a name for that child in most cases. We don't add them on our family tree. We don't have a funeral for them. We mourn a lot of lost opportunities. But just like it's tragic when someone really wants to get married and they're engaged and then that engagement breaks off, it's tragic when the pregnancy ends prematurely, but it doesn't make that fetus a person. Another one, a little bit more comical, that I saw that kind of falls into this line is a cartoon. You brought up Thanos earlier. You have a pregnant woman, Thanos snaps, and then all of a sudden the woman has disappeared and her fetus, it falls on the floor and is like, what the? Because that's the logic, is that it's equally a person. And so if a pregnant woman got snapped by Thanos, could the fetus have a 50-50 shot of just landing on the ground? And that's an interesting thought. And of course, it's a sci-fi fantasy movie, and so you don't necessarily have to go there. But you do kind of introduce that doubt. into the side of the pro-life. It's very hard as a pro-choice person to say that the fetus is 0% a human being, that it's 0% a living thing. The moment of conception, DNA has been created. It's more than zero, or at least it's very hard to convince people otherwise. But what all you're saying as a pro-choice person is it's not 100%. And if it's less than 100%, then other factors can be introduced that might outweigh it. If it's 100% a life, then maybe we have a different conversation, but it's not 100%, and you don't think it is either.
And the response to this argument, I think, kind of starts to go into what the strongest pro-life argument, I think, which is when do you have full 100% value? When do you become 100% human? What is the point where human life has full dignity or full inherent value? And how do you draw those lines? Because if you start to draw the line on, okay, well, a fetus isn't 100% a human life because it relies on its mother for oxygen or for food, or it's not 100% a human life because it's dependent in some way on the mother's body, or if the mother is removed from the equation, it is likely to perish. If you use that as the standard to say that this is now a life that isn't 100% human, or it doesn't have 100% value that a human being, that, generally in Western civilization, we all agree that human life has some sort of inherent value. When you start to draw that distinction and you take that to its logical conclusion, then individuals who are in a coma, individuals who are on life support for oxygen, who are of a feeding tube, who have a pacemaker, their heart needs help to function, are those individuals now less human and will have less inherent value and dignity than someone who does not? I think we can all, that. How are you going to draw that line? And at what point does that human dignity arrive? Is it the birth canal? What is it about the birth canal that bestows value into a human life? Is there like a little sticker you get on the way out? Is it, what is it that creates that value that apparently you see as lacking? And so if you can't have this standard and rationally apply it in all the circumstances, if you can't take this to its logical conclusion and apply it logically to other people, then I question the validity, or you can question, I guess you could say, you can question the validity of that position. So, because if we were to apply, like I said, if we were to apply that to people on life support, so if I walk into a bedroom and there's a person there who has, a feeding tube and is using oxygen to keep their lungs going, or they're having a pacemaker, if I pull out a knife and stab them in the head, that's still murder, right? Or if we take the idea that because you're not fully functioning on your own, you're not fully human being, I killed something that wasn't fully human. So when you apply that and try to put these arbitrary restrictions or arbitrary hoops to jump through for life, it leads to some pretty dark places. And so the most logically consistent place that respects life, and the idea that human life from conception to end or termination of life has the same values, more logically consistent, and prevents you from getting into those nasty kind of, all right, so can we kill people with pacemakers now? Like if someone's in a coma, can I just stab them in the brain and vacuum it out and just call it good? And that's the pro-life response, I think, to your argument, is that human life has full value, and as soon as you start making arbitrary distinctions, you lead to some really dark, nasty outcomes.
And I agree 100% that this is the strongest argument on the pro-life side. Another one that I think is pretty good, but I decided not to include, is one where you say, even if it's not 100% a life, just because it's an embryo doesn't mean we jump from there to now let's kill it. It's going to be a human being. If you damage a bald eagle egg, you can be sentenced to up to 1 year in prison. All of those sorts of arguments. The reason that one's not as strong as the one Jacob just put forward is because it's a direct response to the strongest pro-choice argument. And so now they just have to clash it out on the merits. But this pro-life argument, or the you can't draw arbitrary lines because then you'll start killing adults argument that Jacob put forward, is stronger than the other pro-life argument, because there's not really a direct pro-choice response to, or at least not a common one that I've heard a lot, or I've heard a lot of people rationalize. It's a lot harder to rebut. And so if you have a strong argument that doesn't have a ready rebuttal to it, that inherently makes your argument stronger by comparison. So that's, I think, where that strength tends to come from. Now, where I would push back a little bit on this argument, or let me add this first. What I find so interesting then, if this is the strongest pro-life argument, and the pro-choice argument that we put forward is the strongest pro-choice argument, or at least the one that I put forward, that it's not 100% of life, if you're going to make your best pro-choice argument, you have to rely on it's not 100% of life and it's not 0% of human life. It's somewhere in the middle. Whereas when you're making the best pro-life argument, you have to say it is 100% of life. You cannot say it's less than 100%, because then you have to start deciding, well, when is it 100% of life? And that's where the pro-life argument starts to fall apart, because I don't think most pro-life people have thought that far in advance. But the one criticism that I can give it offhand is that, we had an example of, what if a person's on a pacemaker? What if a person's on an oxygen tank? What if they're in a coma? What if they're an infant and they don't have life experience? What if they have dementia and they don't have life experience? Okay, what about a person who is on a pacemaker and on an oxygen tank and an infant and with dementia and in a coma? It's not just that you have these isolated parts of the person that you can find in an adult. You have a totality of I'm trying to think of the right phrasing for it, but you have a totality of circumstances here that would indicate that this person is not living a fullness of life, or a fullness of life experience at the very least. And so then you can start from that to take a little bit away from that 100%, because like I said, that pro-life argument has to rely on this is 100% a human life. If you can knock it down even 1 percentage point by saying it's a totality of circumstances, it's the totality of no heartbeat, no oxygen, no sentience, etc., then the pro-choice argument starts to knock it down a little bit and get stronger.
To which the pro-lifer would then basically say, because you use the phrase specifically, their human experience or what they're experiencing is lessened by, they're having the coma, they're having all these different, the coma, the dementia, they're an infant, they're on oxygen. Then you can basically say any person who had experienced any sort of hardship, from losing a job and not fully experiencing what it is to be employed, or who is unmarried or not in any relationships, so they're not fully experiencing human love and human sexuality, or they've lost a limb, or they cannot walk without assistance anymore, that they're losing that human experience of walking, or the human experience of companionship, or blindness, the human experience of sight or sound, that somehow makes them less human. And that now that pro-choice mentality starts to take away their humanity as well. And so you have to be kind of careful and cognizant of kind of the logical conclusions or the logical consequences of these arguments. And one that I would point out, if I was on the pro-choice, arguing from the pro-choice side, against you have to treat it like a human life from conception to death, is pointing out all the pragmatic issues that start to arise immediately from using that standard. So are we going then to protect the right to life, to protect the baby from conception to birth to death eventually, are we going to now create a government bureaucracy or an office that, when you become pregnant, you have to go and register and let this bureaucracy know that you are pregnant? Are we going to have an investigative panel every time someone has a miscarriage? Are we going to have to investigate, well, where were you at this time and this date when you were pregnant? And then when you weren't this way, are we going to put women essentially on trial for the circumstances surrounding, what could be an innocent, miscarriages are tragic, but they happen frequently. Are we going to start to put women through these kinds of for what is already a sensitive time and a difficult experience? Are we going to make it that much more difficult through legal proceedings? Are we going to have doctors violate their patient privilege and have to disclose to the government that someone came in with a pregnancy that is now gone, and have to give there's all these kind of, how are you going to administer and actually effectively protect this standard you've created? Is this an unattainable standard, or a standard that then begins to erode on other liberties, or that is really just untenable?
Mm-hmm. So everyone, those are the arguments that we're putting forward. Those are what we think are the strongest arguments and the worst arguments on each side of the abortion issue. Tell us what you think. What's the winning argument? Who's right? Is there a better argument that we didn't include? Let us know. Thank you for listening to this first episode of The Proving Ground. I'm Richie Angel here for Jacob Hibbert, and we look forward to seeing you next time.